And welcome to another lesson about language development. In this lesson, we're going to discuss how children who are growing up in bilingual households develop, how their language builds up over time, and how that compares to monolingual acquisition and some of the features of bilingual children's productions. The first big difference in the task being performed by children acquiring more than one language and children acquiring just one language is that children acquiring two languages have to know that they're acquiring two languages and be able to sort their input into categories. So audible input or visual input to the child is not doesn't come tagged as being one language or another, right? So the child has to be able to say that sentence was in English and that sentence was in Spanish, right? So at some point, children have to be sorting these different utterances that they hear into two categories. And so the first thing that we have to ask when we're wondering about bilingual or multilingual acquisition is, when do children figure out that they're supposed to be learning two languages and how to recognize which utterances are part of which language, right? So this is an important task that is being performed by multilingual children that is not being performed by monolingual children. Monolingual children, all they really have to do is figure out the rules governing the input that they're given, whereas multilingual children actually have to sort the input that they're given into two categories before they figure out the rules. We've talked in previous lessons about how even when children are just 1 to 4 days old, really barely newborn children can recognize a shift from one language to another among certain language pairs. So between English and Japanese, children will recognize that shift. They'll recognize a shift between English and French. They'll recognize a shift between French and Japanese. These are languages that are very different in terms of their inflection and their rhythm, right? So but children can't do this with every language pair, right? So pairs of languages that have similar rhythm and inflection, like English and Dutch or like Spanish and Italian, are harder for children to distinguish from one another, and they can't usually do that from birth. And this shows that they're using rhythm and prosody to recognize, oh, that was a shift in rhythm and prosody, right? So it's possible that children may be separating out the languages that they're learning from the moment that they're born, especially if they're learning a pair of very different languages. So if a child is in a household that's a bilingual English and Japanese household, that child will be able to recognize the difference between English and Japanese from the moment that they're born. And so it's very possible that they are splitting their input from that early age. So, but by 4.5 months old, all children can distinguish their native language from even very similar languages using their rhythm and intonation. So as long as you give them a complete sentence or a paragraph or something like that, they'll be able to recognize the difference between English and Dutch and the difference between Spanish and Italian, which means that by this phase, by about 4.5 months of age, children should all be separating out their different languages, which means both that they should be able to figure out which, that is a language that I have heard before that I'm working on learning, right? So that's the task that monolingual children are doing at this point, is that they're able to say that's a language that I'm learning. Bilingual children can do that at the same time. They can say that's a language that I'm learning. But it also means that that the bilingual children should be able to distinguish between this is the first language that I'm learning and this is the second language that I'm learning, right? They should be able to tell when somebody uses a sentence of Spanish, oh, that's a Spanish sentence versus that's an Italian sentence, right? So this is, by the time children are 4.5 months old, they have all the perceptual capabilities that they need to be able to separate out their two languages, as long as they're getting big paragraphs. Individual words may be harder for them to identify until about 7 months. But as long as they're using rhythm and intonation, they should be able to figure out that person is speaking Spanish or that person is speaking Italian. Categorical perception, which we discussed before, is something that develops in children by 6 to 10 months of age. So this is, or the language-specific version of categorical perception develops between 6 and 10 months of age, which means that you are focusing in on the sound contrasts that are relevant for the language that you're learning, and this happens at the same age for monolingual and bilingual infants, which means that children are not only figuring out what sound contrast they need to know for the two languages that they're learning, but they're also figuring out what are the different sound contrasts in each of these two languages. And for this reason, this is a really tricky thing to test because children acquiring two languages know that they're acquiring two languages and get really upset if you give them a distinction that's not in one language or the other, that's sort of in between. And so you have to be really careful when you do these tests of categorical perception on bilingual infants that you're using really carefully selected stimuli, that your sound contrasts that you're testing are very carefully selected. There are also sort of differences in what tends to surprise bilingual and monolingual children, right? Bilingual children, for example, are more used to seeing one object receive two names than a monolingual child would be. And so when you design these experiments around measurements of surprise, like time to habituation and stuff like that, you have to be really careful that you're choosing something that would surprise both a bilingual and a monolingual child equally, right? So these are really tricky things to test. Perception in bilingual infants is harder to test than perception in monolingual infants, but from what we can tell, categorical perception proceeds at about the same pace for bilingual and monolingual infants. As we've discussed before, the first form of production that is really found in children is babbling. And for the most part, babbling is the same in all children across all languages in the world, but there are some slight differences in the babbling of monolingual children learning different languages. So there are slight preferences for specific features of their native language. You might see differences in the frequency with which vowels of certain lengths are used. You might see trends in somebody learning French might use slightly different vowel qualities than somebody learning English. Somebody learning French might use nasal consonants with a different frequency than somebody learning English, right? So there are slight frequency alternations that you can use to sort of figure out if this child is babbling in language A or language B. And interestingly, at the babbling stage, there's some evidence that bilingual children actually babble in two separate languages, right? So when you are in a household where the child is being raised in a one parent, one language household, children babbling to a French-speaking parent present more French-like babbling frequencies than children babbling to an English-speaking parent, where they use more English-like babbling frequencies. So there's some evidence that children are aware of what language they're babbling in, even though what they're saying is nonsense, which is pretty fascinating. So we have some evidence that there are distinct phonological systems developing, that children are conscious of the difference between these two languages, that they are actively working to produce these two different languages, even at the stage where all they're saying is ma, 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 ma in both languages, which is pretty fascinating. So children acquiring two languages, just like children acquiring one language, start to produce their first words sort of between 18 months and 2 years of age. But unlike children acquiring one language, they may hear words in two different languages, and they may not acquire the words for the word for a thing at the same time in both languages. So they might have only the word hat in English. They may not know the French word for the word hat, and they may have the word for truck only in French rather than in English and French, right? And so there is this period where children may have only one option for a word, even though they're learning two different languages. It's also important to note that unlike the achievement of saying a first word, right, which is a cognitive task, right? You have to have a concept of a word. You have to be able to conceive of a word referencing something, right? There's a cognitive element in that. Every word that you learn after that takes the same amount of learning investment, which means that a child who's trying to learn two different languages is just going to take longer to memorize words in each of those languages, right? So you can have a 50-word vocabulary if you're a perfectly 50-50 bilingual child, and your 50-word vocabulary will still only have 25 words in English and 25 words in French. And what that means is that children acquiring multiple languages may reach vocabulary milestones in each language more slowly than children learning those languages monolingually. And this can be most striking early in children's language development because the word spurt, which we've talked about, right? So the rate at which you acquire new vocabulary items is dependent on how many vocabulary items you have, right? So until you reach 50 words, your vocabulary doesn't start to increase exponentially, right? Is the idea, right? And so if it takes you longer to get to that sort of baseline of basic word knowledge that is going to help you acquire more words faster, it's going to take you longer to get to that point where you're acquiring more words faster. So it can take children learning words in multiple languages a longer time to develop large vocabularies in each of those languages. But children are still acquiring words very quickly. But, it can be a little bit, it may lag behind monolingual children a little bit, especially during this sort of early word phase. So children who are growing up bilingual may be developing the vocabularies of their languages a little bit more slowly than children who are growing up monolingual, but bilingual children still reach that same cognitive jump to put words together to create more complex meanings around 2 years of age, just like monolingual children do, right? So bilingual children, monolingual children both start putting together sentences at the same time. But there are some interesting features of bilingual children's early sentences that are not present in monolingual children's sentences. And this is mostly, the most interesting of these features is called code mixing. And in these utterances, a child will build their early productions with words from 2 different languages. They'll involve different languages in one utterance. So, for example, in this study of a little girl acquiring Norwegian and English, she produced the utterance mer paper to mean more paper, which is 2 different languages. Den full to mean it's full. Ne kitty, no kitty. Bygge cow, I assume that's how you say that. I'm not sure. I'm not a Norwegian speaker, but build the cow, right? So these are utterances that involve words from 2 different languages. And so why do children who are acquiring multiple languages, if, as we've been discussing before, they're clearly developing 2 different systems, so why do they mix these 2 different systems together when they start putting together words, even though they know there's 2 different systems? There's some different explanations that we could use to explain this. The first and most obvious explanation for why this might be the case is that the child doesn't know or can't recall the meaning of or the pronunciation of a word in one of their languages. So if the child is going along telling a story in English and they reach the place where they want to talk about a hippopotamus and they can't remember the word for hippo in English, but they can remember it in Norwegian, so they just plop the Norwegian word in that spot and keep going, right? So in that case, it clearly does explain some early cases of code mixing, because as we've talked about, you learn words at different paces in different languages, right? So just because you know the English word for hippo doesn't mean you've ever been exposed to the Norwegian word for hippo, right? So this clearly explains some very early code mixing, but it doesn't always explain it. So let's look at an example in which not knowing the word doesn't explain why the child is choosing to use a word from a different language. Here's an example of a conversation between this little girl learning Norwegian and her mother, right? So the little girl needs some more paper. She's drawing, and the mother says, Siri, run and find it, right? Uses the word run. So we know that the daughter knows the word run in English. And yet she's choosing to use the Norwegian word and uses it several times with the mother, even though they're speaking in English right now, right? So the child has used this Norwegian word, and then the mother prompts her to try to get her to speak English, since this is a one parent, one language household, right? And her language is supposed to be English. And the daughter can produce run, right? So clearly this little girl knows the word run in English and yet had chosen to use the Norwegian word for some reason, right? So this is not explained by the fact that the girl doesn't know the word run. It's explained by something else. We have to have some other explanation for why a child would do this. An explanation that people often use to present for this type of behavior is that the child doesn't recognize that there are two separate languages. Now, this seems weird to us at this point because we've just been talking about how the child definitely knows that there's two different languages, right? It is definitely the case that children have sorted out the fact that they're learning two different languages by the time they're producing their earliest two-word utterances. Now, it's possible that they may not know for every single word what language that word goes with, right? So it's possible that for individual words, they may be confused about whether it's an English word or a Norwegian word. And it is also possible that children may be overextending a word into multiple languages, right? So especially for a child who's learning two languages that have some words in common, like Norwegian and English, there are some words that you can basically use in both languages, right? So it's not a crazy assumption that you might have a word or two that translate between the two languages. So it's possible that to a certain extent, a child may be miscategorizing a word, but it's unlikely that this is because the child doesn't actually know that there are two separate languages, right? It would mostly be because the child hasn't figured out that this word is part of this language or this language, right? It's mostly a problem of missorting one word. A more likely explanation is that this child is just code switching. Code switching is something that adults do, adult bilingual speakers do, and it's an intentional switch from one language to another, sometimes in the middle of an utterance. It usually goes along with some sort of change in the perspective of the speaker. You know, the speaker usually does code switching for a reason, but in really fluently bilingual households, that's not always true. There's not always a detectable reason for switching languages. Sometimes it's just because you felt like it, right? So code switching is something that adults do, and here's an example of it. This is a paragraph produced by somebody who is a Spanish-English bilingual, and you can see that there's two different languages involved in this paragraph. And the first time this person switches into Spanish from English, which is the language it starts in, into Spanish, they're switching in order to go into a quote, right? So if you were originally speaking in Spanish, it sort of makes sense that as long as you're speaking to somebody who understands Spanish, that you wouldn't translate the quote that you're the thing that you said, right? The thing that I said, since I said it in Spanish the first time, I'm going to say it in Spanish this time. But the second time we get a code switch, there's not much reason that you would need to change back to English just for he's not, right? That's just because you can, right? So sometimes code switching is for a purpose, and other times code switching just happens in adult speech. So it's reasonable to assume that you could just have code switching that just happens in child speech as well. One thing that's often confused people about code mixing in children is that unlike code switching in adults, where usually people code switch only with people who they know speak both languages, right? So if you are speaking to another Spanish-English bilingual, you might code switch into Spanish, but if you're speaking with somebody who's a monolingual English speaker, you're much less likely to do it. Or, if you did it, it would only be for words that you thought they probably knew in Spanish, right? But children acquiring multiple languages will often code switch or code mix with people who don't speak their second language. And this happens a lot, actually. I have a young friend who just came back from Denmark and had been speaking Danish while she was there, and she came back and wanted to tell us the whole story of her trip to Denmark in Danish. She was 2 years old at the time, and she didn't recognize the fact that we didn't speak Danish. And so this has led some people to think that that children at this age actually don't know that they're switching between two different languages. But the reality is that there's really two separate tasks going on here. You have to not only recognize that there are two languages, which children at this age basically are doing. They recognize that there are two different languages that they speak, but you also have to recognize that not everybody speaks two languages, right? So if they speak two languages, it's not crazy to assume that this person that they just met might speak two languages also, right? And so there's a whole bunch of social context that you have to build up to figure out what's the majority language. If I've just met this person, what's the chances that they're going to be able to speak Danish with me? What are the chances that they're going to be speaking English with me? And so for a child who's just been in Denmark, who just comes back to the United States, their guesses about that might be really confused, right? This is a person that I've never spoken Danish with before, but maybe they know it, right? Because everybody who I was just with knew it, right? So it's not crazy that you would use the wrong language with people. And this is something that children mostly get resolved by their sometime during the second or third year. It depends how much they're moving around between different contexts. But children actually are pretty quick at figuring out who knows what language. And it can help a child to inform them what languages other people speak, because they'll feel more comfortable speaking with them if they know, oh, this is the language that they're going to understand, right? So once a child reaches the age where they can talk about the fact that they speak two different languages, it can help them to just tell them, right? So this can resolve some of these issues for children, to make sure that they know what languages other people speak, because they don't always have the full context to be able to figure that out for themselves. Right, so that was our really fast tour through bilingual development. The main takeaways from this lesson should be that children who are learning more than one language know that they're acquiring two separate languages from a really young age. It could be birth if they're two very different languages, but it's certainly by 4.5 months, they know that they're acquiring two separate languages, or that people are speaking two separate languages around them. They achieve the cognitive milestones of speech production at the same time as monolingual children. So the things like sorting out the sounds that are contrastive in their language, things like putting together two words, things like producing their first words. These things happen at the same time as monolingual children, but they may lag a little bit behind monolingual children on memorization tasks in each language, right? So if you look at the cumulative vocabulary of bilingual children, they're about the same, or maybe even larger, eventually larger than the vocabularies of monolingual children, but in each language, their vocabulary is going to be smaller for a while. And some of these memorization tasks are also going to be things like grammatical constructions, right? So if you just need more data to figure it out, right, it may be that they haven't received enough data yet, and so they may lag a little behind even on things like grammatical constructions, but they all get sorted out, right? It just means that you might be a couple months slower on certain tasks. Except for a brief period in early word learning, though, usually the skills of bilingual children overall will exceed the skills of monolingual children. Children maintain two separate languages, which they can switch between just like adults can, which is pretty fascinating. Even from the time when they're producing two-word utterances, children are able to switch between them and recognize that adults will recognize both words regardless of which language they're using. So in summary, children who are acquiring multiple languages are pretty amazing and develop more or less at the same pace as monolingual children.